It's easier to kind of master it technically. And I think finding your voice in it, I think just that's the hard part. That's the taking a lot of pictures part and the looking at pictures on the big table, small prints, that's that's where the real work has to happen.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 376 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I'm excited to bring you Suzanne Revy, a guest that was recommended to me by listener Jean Fain. Thanks, Jean. Suzanne brings wisdom from her career as a photo editor for U.S. News and World Report magazine. We touch on the importance of why and how one should create an artist statement, her approaches to making triptych images, and the ever-challenging dynamic that exists between viewers and the creators of photographs. It's a packed episode, so be sure to listen all the way through. Before we jump in, I have some people I need to, want to thank. These awesome folks have stepped up to support the show on Patreon, and you're all amazing. Lee Nordby, Dristy Arya, Michelle Bernier, Ken Henke, Bill Plunkett, and Tony Hewitt. Thank you all so much for your support. Much love. If you too would like to feel great by supporting this free podcast, please find out how by going to mattpaynephotography.com/podcast. All right, let's get to this week's episode with Suzanne Revy. All right, Suzanne Revy, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I am happy that we made this connection. One of our students on one of the workshops I led in Newfoundland, she recommended you for the show and made the connection. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, that was nice of her. Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, for people who aren't familiar with you, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, sure. I'm Suzanne Revy. I'm a photographer, a writer, and an educator. I do photography for myself mostly. The writing I write about other people's photographs. I write reviews of photography exhibitions in and around Boston.
Oh.
And also do some teaching, helping people write artist statements and project statements and their bios, stuff like that. It's always important to kind of contextualize your work with some writing. And I teach out at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. So I've been teaching an intro to darkroom class and a documentary photography class out there this semester. So, which is great. I love my students out there. So
that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I'm married and I've got two boys who were the subject of a long-term photographic project, but they're both now actually finished with college. So we're in a semi-empty nest. One of them is living at home. The other one is down in New York.
Did you ever get the, Mom, will you put the camera away?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think my husband got that more because he could be a little more intrusive. I was always a little more fly on the wall kind of photographer because I didn't want them to stop and pose. I wanted to photograph them as what they were doing.
Nice.
So I was always trying to be kind of in the margins of their conscious when I was photographing them.
Yeah. Some of my favorite photographs are when my son was between age 4 and 10. It was just such a fun time to watch his, there's so much that changes so fast at that age. And so that was a lot of fun for me photographing those moments for sure.
Yeah. It's amazing that time. Yeah.
And now he's 16 and it's like, good luck even finding him. So
yeah. They go into their rooms and you're not sure when they're going to come out,
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, Suzanne, let's kick this off simply. What originally drew you to pick up the camera?
So I'm going to date myself here a little bit. I suspect I have a few years on you. I picked up the camera when I was a teenager, which was the late 70s. And I was a little bit of a frustrated artist because I could never draw really. Like I had this impression that drawing just came to you naturally, either that or you can either draw or you can't, right? A few years later, I figured out that you can, in fact, learn how to draw. But But I picked up a camera, I think, because I was a little bit frustrated as an artist with my drawing skills. And my mom was an artist, and she took a class in photography and changed a little closet we had into a dark room. And I just started going in there and learning how, all that magic in the dark room. So that's kind of how that started, and just taking pictures and try. My dad gave me a knicker mat, which I still have. Sentimental about that camera. It's jammed up, doesn't work anymore, but I still keep it. So that's kind of where it started, and then I went to college and studied photography at art school, and I've been involved in photography in one way or another ever since.
Nice. And then how closely have you been involved in photography in terms of it being part of your career or professional life versus other things that you've been involved in?
Right. So it's been in my professional life, like pretty much all the way through. So I was a photo editor at a news magazine for a long time back in the 90s. So I was assigning photographers, sort of editing. And by editing, I mean selecting pictures and culling them down, and then creating short sequences to sort of tell narrative stories. And then sort of just that whole selection process of the photographs for the magazine. And it was a weekly news magazine called U.S. News and World Report.
I've
And
never
then
heard of that one.
oh, really? Yeah, they're
That's
gone. I mean,
sarcasm, by the way.
okay. They are
I
gone.
mean,
Like, it's a weekly magazine, they're gone. They still publish their like college books and stuff like
right.
that.
I'm pretty sure they were pretty big, right?
Oh yeah, there were three weekly news magazines, and they were the third. They were the smallest of the three, but they were absolutely, Time
Yeah.
and Newsweek were the other ones, and I think Time is the only one that's still kind of standing as a magazine. So yeah, that world is very different now. But I worked there for a long time, and then we moved up to New England. My husband took a job up here. I did a short stint I filled in for somebody who was on a leave of absence for Yankee Magazine, which is a regional kind of lifestyle magazine here in New England, based up in New Hampshire. At the time, it was kind of a nice little digest sized magazine, and they did deep picture stories. So like I
Mm.
was able to edit some really nice long form picture stories for that magazine. So that was kind of a pleasure to work for them for a bit. And then that job ended, and I was sort of wondering, what am I going to do with myself? And happily, I got pregnant and had my first child, I guess in 99. He was born in 99. And a couple years later, I built a darkroom in my basement. I just wanted to get back into the darkroom. It had been a long time since college that I'd done that kind of work, and I started to photograph my kids. It's funny, I built the darkroom, and you could see this digital wave coming, but I just wanted to get my hands wet. So I did this long-term project with my kids in black and white. Eventually moved out of 35 millimeter and started using a medium format rangefinder camera with that,
Mm.
and loved printing those big, beautiful negatives. And that kind of snowballed. So that project lasted about 10 years. And I was fortunate to be able to do the mom thing, during this time. So when my kids were real little, I was doing the mom thing. And so while I was keeping an eye on them, making sure they were staying alive from day to day, I was also photographing them and their friends. And as they got older, that project shifted, and I moved to using it's actually I consider it one portfolio with three chapters. So the first is the black and white, and then I started shooting color film, kind of in their preteen years, and with a Holga, like a plastic, toy camera. That lasted for a couple years. There was this kind of moment between their being really little and teenagers where they were still happy to be in my company, but they were kind of out. We were out in the world more, and the Holga is such a non-threatening piece of gear, where the Mamiya 7 is this big clunky. And plus, I just wanted to be a little more present with them myself, so the camera wasn't getting in the way. And then, like what you just described, my kids became teenagers and went into their rooms. The Holga wasn't going to work anymore. Plus, my own feeling, my own sense shifted. And so I did this I shifted my attention to the interior stuff, in the teenage kind of stuff. And I did manage to make some pictures while they were teenagers. And I did that. I went back to school and got my MFA at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. And then I started teaching after that. up to about 2016, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot to chew on right there. I was immediately struck by your background in photo editing, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
I find the thing that most photographers struggle with, including myself, is kind of that curation piece, that, looking at your body of work and trying to figure
Hmm.
out what makes sense to keep, what makes sense to get rid of, and how do you coordinate and collate down to a body of work that makes sense, or put it into different buckets that make sense. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, what advice would you have for people like me who struggle with that particular aspect of photography?
I think that's hard for me too. And although because I have experience with looking at a lot of pictures like that, I can step back and be a little bit more objective about my work. But I think most people, it's difficult to separate the emotional wherewithal, like what you were doing, how you made this picture, especially if it was a difficult picture to make. It's like, oh, but I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro to get this picture, and it's like,
Right.
well, it's kind of an okay picture, and
Right.
and to sort of step back and kind of realize that, when you really have an emotional attachment to what you went through to get a photograph. So I think that the best thing is to form like a critique group and have a fresh set of eyes help you with that. Because I think this is one of the things, I sort of feel like there's a couple things you have to master in photography. One of them is shooting. One of them is processing, like how you're, a lot of people call this part the editing, right? I call it processing, what you're doing in Photoshop, what you're doing in the darkroom to make your pictures more expressive.
Hmm.
I think you have to master that. And then the last piece is this kind of calling and editing, and sequencing. Like and I think it's okay to get help on well, not the shooting so much, but it's okay to get help with the editing or even the processing. I feel
Oh, for
like
sure.
it's like it's okay to get a second set of eyes or to have someone help you with that. I don't think you should just think you have to master all these three things. Like, give yourself a break, and
Yeah. Yeah, no,
so
I think that's good advice. I've definitely gravitated more towards just assuming everything is not good, and and then I and then I give it to friends of mine and I said, like, what have I missed? And like, always they give me feedback that I missed. I think it's
yeah, it's
fantastic way
and
to.
they don't have that attachment
Right.
that is so hard to give up, and you do sometimes have to, the old saying, you kill your darlings. I mean, you do sometimes have to take a picture out of a sequence. It might be a really great photograph, but if it's not playing well with the rest, then the sequence, it'll weaken the sequence,
Hmm.
so it is hard. It's definitely
Yeah.
hard to do that, but I would really strongly suggest critique groups, mentors, occasional workshops, stuff like that. I think it's really just getting another set of eyes on your work is important.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that a lot of the focus of a lot of your work historically has been on portraits of your children.
Yeah.
As a kind of a portrait practitioner, what's been your approach to making landscape photographs?
Well, I'll tell you kind of the genesis of looking at the landscape. It was partly driving my kids around right when the light was getting nice. And I live in this leafy suburb of Boston. And I was always looking at trees thinking, oh God, I'd love to photograph that tree. And one thing about trees is they feel to me like individual people.
Mm. Hmm.
They can look like human beings, gestural, texture, different colored leaves, all that stuff. And so I think I was taking pictures in my mind while I was, doing the driving around thing, being the teen limo driver. And, and so it was. And then finally, it's the sort of, they started leaving the nest here and I just started going into the landscape. The other thing that inspired me, sometime in like 2014, I picked up a book called Early Color by Saul Leiter. I don't know if you know his work. He was actually quite a successful commercial photographer, but he also did a lot of street photography in New York in color, like in the 60s, and kind of before people were shooting a lot of color. And his pictures, I had not really paid attention to his work until this book, and I was like, wow, this is fantastic work. I loved it, and I just thought, oh, I want to get back to doing street photography, which is what I had done when I was in college in New York, but I lived in this leafy suburb. And I started to think, well, what is Saul Leiter really photographing? I mean, if you know his work, yeah, he's out on the streets of New York, but a lot of the pictures are very abstract. They're very atmospheric. They're very colorful and textural. And I thought, well, he's not really photographing the people as such. I mean, he's making these abstractions. And I thought, I have this crowded woods behind my house. I can treat that like a street scene. And so I started to make these pictures inspired a little bit by the way in which Saul Leiter was photographing. And then eventually it morphed into what I'm doing now, which is the triptychs, So it took a little time because I wasn't quite sure. I don't really think of myself as a landscape person. I like going out and hiking and all that, but like I'm not a big camping kind of person. I like my bed. So all the landscapes I make are really close to home, and I just really literally started with the trees in my backyard. Like we have kind of some wetlands right behind us, and those were my initial sort of forays into the landscape, and it was with, I think, a portraitist's eye that I was looking at, these lovely, they're right out there, trees that are surround us. So
I love that approach in terms of looking for gesture or looking for emotional expression or other human qualities that the objects in the landscape might have. That's awesome. So I know early on in this conversation, you talked a lot about the importance of artist statements and contextualizing our work. And that's something I really wanted to talk to you about, because I think it's something, again, that most people struggle with, including myself. So one thing I noticed about your website that I found was quite different than other photographers is you had multiple artist statements that were based on different time periods of your photography career. Which I thought was really a really cool idea. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of artist statements and your approach to writing one?
So I'm a very intuitive shooter. I mean, like talking about the beginnings of my landscape work, and I won't really start writing about my work until I've amassed a little bit, right? And then when I get to that point where there's enough to kind of look at and do that editing process, right? Culling and sequencing and thinking about it. And it's only then that I'll start to understand maybe what I was thinking or what I was doing, and I will start to write my thoughts down on what I was doing. I also believe that project statements or artist statements should be kind of living documents. So as the work evolves, so should the statement. You should kind of keep it up. And it just helps. Like the statement I have for my landscapes started out very differently because I wrote a story about one of the first ones that I made, which is kind of no longer in the portfolio because it was constructed a little bit differently. It just doesn't quite fit anymore. It looks different, but I just wrote this story about making that one, and it was kind of the first sort of foray into trying this, process, or one of the first forays into that, and so I sort of just wrote the story of making that picture. It was a picture I made in a blizzard, like it was, the snow was going sideways, and I had my back, I was handheld too, like I did it with Lumia 7, but all the pictures are horizontal, and I realized even with that one, I needed to be vertical. Like it's much easier to make a triptych with the vertical format. But it was my husband and son, and we were just, these trees with snow on their side, and I kind of liked the picture, and it had me thinking. So I just told the story of that. And then the other thing that I started to feel like I was going to need, especially if I was going to try and put the work out there in the world, was I knew that people were going to ask me, well, why triptychs? Sometimes you get asked these questions, and it's just like, it's really good to have like an
You
answer.
better have, I was going to say, you better have an answer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, and it
Yeah.
took me a while. It took me a while to kind of, because I didn't really know why I was interested in doing that at first. Like I just was just interested in playing around with that. I had done actually a small project with my iPhone for a while. I was just doing daily kind of Instagram type pictures, and I actually printed several of them and had a small show and started to organize them in groupings. And it had me thinking about, how do you make a single piece of art from multiple pictures? Can you make like a single piece? So that work was partly a catalyst that led to the triptychs as well, even though it was just an iPhone exercise, really. Sometimes I find it's helpful to pull back from making pictures in a more difficult way. Like the phone is just such an easy way to make pictures. You have it with you. And I was thinking, looking at what I was doing there, which was work I was not thinking about that deeply, and then when I started to pull it together and do a little show, then I wrote a short statement for that work. And it did start to make me think about, okay, what is it that I'm doing with these triptychs? And I was influenced a little bit by the grid of Instagram. I think we're all used to seeing that. I mean, it used to be a little better because it was a real grid, but I don't really, of course I get distracted by it too, which annoys me, like these reels of, and videos. Like I don't really want to see videos. I want to see photographs in that
Right.
grid, but it seems they have moved on from that apparently. So it's a little less helpful than it was when I started. I feel like I may
Yeah.
have veered away from the question.
No, that's
We're talking
okay.
about
That's okay.
statements. So yeah, but I just think writing, and I think it's very helpful. And I think for people who don't like to write, and I know that photographers don't like to write because they like to make photographs, but I think it's important, if you're out photographing, keep a little notebook, write down your thoughts, write down, or the other thing that I really like is when you wake up in the morning, if you've had a dream or something, like write down things that come into your mind first thing in the morning. And I think that as you're working on a project, you might find that the notes you collect will become the basis for like a first draft of a statement. And then after you have a first draft, the real trick is then just editing it and rewriting it and editing, like, and refining it. And all the best writing comes from that part of it, rewriting it and
hmm
editing, so.
So let's say a photographer has a body of work, let's say something between 40 and 400 images. Let's just somewhere in that ballpark. What do you think is the most logical approach to sitting down, looking at the body of work, and then generating an artist statement that actually reflects something meaningful and useful for that photographer's audience?
Well, you got to get it down from 400. I mean, you got to get it, like get it to 40. And to me, a 40 is a really broad edit. And but for me, and this might be because I'm old school, I really like having small 4x6 prints, just
hmm
generate. I just did this with a student at Clark. He'd done this big, huge project photographing Worcester and some of the sort of decaying buildings there. Really great work. And it wasn't until, we finally figured out, let's just get a bunch of pictures, and he ran a big piece of paper and cut them all down. And, we were finally able to cull it and create a sequence. So he's got it down to, I think we got it down to 18 pictures, something like that. Nice tight edit. We might have done some groupings of different sort of types of places he'd photographed, and then from that made kind of a master sequence. So there's a little more in the portfolio, but a final one that you might take to a portfolio review, I would say shouldn't be more than 20 pictures. And then writing the statement, I think at that point, once you do have kind of a set group of pictures, it can suddenly be much clearer to you what you've done,
Mm.
and it can be a little easier than to write the statement. And then in this case I'm thinking of right now with the student of mine, I mean, he wrote a pretty clear statement. It was pretty good writing to begin with. And I just helped him edit it and just make it a little more readable. I think a lot of people make the mistake of using a passive voice. You definitely want to use an active voice in your statements. it's hard to sort of write about yourself, right? Me, my, I. And I would avoid that, but don't use a passive voice. Like you don't want to say me, my, and I a lot in the statement, but you also don't want to be, this happened, like you don't want to be too passive in the writing. So I usually like to start with an anecdote of how your project maybe started, some kind of hook like that, you know. That's sort of the best, strongest way to start.
And
Yeah.
first person, not third person?
I think on a statement, it can be first person. I think the third person, if you ever need to write a bio of your work, that should be in the third person. But the statement can be in the first person. I just, generally speaking, avoid starting with I. Now, having said that, I've read a few statements where I know one gal who starts her statement with, I got pregnant on my wedding night. And but that's a story, right? And you kind of want to read about that, right? And it was a whole project she did on her pregnancy, but I think if you start with, I began to photograph here, I think that can be a little deadly. So if you're going to start with I, make it kind of a declarative start of a story, and that'll draw people in to want to read it. And personally, I like it when I look at work, and then if I read the statement, and if it's a good statement, it will deepen my understanding of someone's work. And I think that's really what you want. You want people to sort of walk away thinking, oh, wow, there's more to this work than I realized. But you want the work to be good enough that they're inclined to read the statement.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it almost seems like it makes sense to have like an overarching artist statement about kind of what you're about in your photography and what your story is.
Yeah.
And ideally, you would have these sub collections of work that had separate statements about what that work is about.
Yeah. So like on my website, I have artist statements, and they each relate to portfolios on the website. The place that does, the template for my website, I would love them to be just at the end of each portfolio, but they only seem to have it. So it's at the beginning, and I don't want the words to start. Like I want you to see a photograph at the beginning. So I just put them all on one page on the website. And so I consider each one of those statements, even though I call them artist statements, they're technically project statements, right? They're each talking about different projects on the site. And then the artist statement, I do have kind of an overarching biography / artist statement that sort of covers kind of like what we've been talking about here, what I've done in the past and the work that I've made, and what my artistic practice is all about.
And then maybe we should have started with the why. Why even do an artist statement to begin with?
I think if you want to get your work out into the world, if you want to get into shows, if you want to promote it at all, I think it's really helpful. I mean, I realize some people say, well, Ansel Adams didn't write artist statements, which is true, but I'm not Ansel Adams, so you know what I mean? Like I need all the help I can get to, get the work out there. I also think it helps you to understand your own work better. I think it makes the work stronger to really sit down and think about it and write about it. It's going to make you a better photographer. I realize that might seem counterintuitive, but I do think the fact that I write, and I don't just write about my own photography. I mean, as I said before, like I feel like because I kind of take a deep dive into a lot of other people's work, I just understand the medium. And I think it helps me be a better artist. I hope it does. I mean, that's why. And it's partly partly marketing, but also partly because I just think it's just one more tool to help you be a better, stronger artist.
Yeah, and I think if you're struggling with what most of us struggle with in terms of finding meaning for your process, I might help you put a little thought into that and attach some meaning to kind of why you're going out to make photos to begin with, which would help then dictate a little bit about what you try to focus your efforts on and things of that nature. So I think it is a valuable process. Yeah. So you had talked a little bit about triptychs. I was really hoping we could talk more about that particular approach about making.
Absolutely.
Is it Polyptychs?
Polyptychs, yeah. So
Polyptychs
triptych,
and triptychs.
I know.
so so
Triptychs are
so
three,
yeah, yeah.
right? A tetraptych is four. There's an SAT word for you. I was calling them quadtychs at the beginning, but somebody pointed out that a quad is Latin and triptych, that's Greek, so it's tetraptych. So that's four. I guess a five is pentaptych. If I figure if it gets bigger than that, then polyptych, because then it's a multiple panel pictures. So
Yeah.
that's what I've been immersed in making lately, and that whole project was a surprise to me because I'm a portrait photographer, and what am I doing out in the woods? and why the triptychs, And I was thinking a lot about perception and changing your point of view slightly, changing your plane of focus slightly. And what I feel like it was helping me do is not just describe the landscape, but interpret it, and it helped kind of layer it with meaning in terms of time, because I take, like, when I make the pictures, I take three separate pictures or four or whatever. And I use film. I'm still kind of old school. I have a Mamiya RZ67, which has a nice ground glass, because I find having a ground glass. I have this nice digital camera that I find really hard to use because I don't like how the viewfinder works. I like this ground glass. Like, I look down, I can kind of organize the picture the way I want to, and I can really see how the focus is working. So that's kind of like why I like that camera, and it helps me to sort of organize what I'm seeing in front of me and what I'm gonna overlap or and I can't always tell how it's gonna look, until I get all the small prints back. So that's kind of how I've been doing that work. It started handheld with the Mamiya 7, but then I was missing too many. Like, they weren't working out well enough. Like, I realized, like, first of all, I realized all three have to work as a complete picture. And then I need something to guide the eye across. And so I was ending up with things not quite, I don't want them to be super exact, but a lot of them just looked like mistakes. And so I finally just realized, okay, I have to get a camera on a tripod, and it's going to be easier with a ground glass than with the rangefinder that I was using. So that's kind of how that happened, and the whole thing flourished during the pandemic. I was still finding my way in it when the pandemic started. I was beginning to kind of get into a groove. So, and the one thing that was hard, like, I live near Walden Pond here, and God, that place was overrun with people during the pandemic. Like, it got so crowded. The path that goes around the pond, they had to make that one way because it's kind of a narrow path, and
Oh, wow.
so I was trying to find places that were not so well known, and crowded, because a lot of people were sort of taking their days and going outside. But I was also going out early in the morning. Like, I love sunrise. And so I'd find these small pockets and small little areas of conservation land and just go out quite early in the morning. And it's, that was such a stressful time for all of us. And it just felt grounding to be able to kind of get out in the landscape, early in the morning. I mean, some days I would go out later in the day. It just helped me kind of navigate what was really a very hard year, I think, for all of us. It really did help to be in nature as much as I was. And I wasn't camping or anything, like I said. I mean, I was out, just going out early in the morning, going out for long walks. And then I started, it's funny, I started to walk in the middle of the day to scout locations, like when the light wasn't great. Because then I thought, I don't want to carry all this heavy gear with me, so I should venture out, right? And there was one point, it was the summer, I think, of 2020, and I took this one path and ended up in this sort of well-known cemetery that's in Concord, and I wasn't even looking for it, but I realized I ended up on Author's Ridge, which is where Henry David Thoreau is buried, and also Louisa May Alcott, like that. And I suddenly thought, oh, I've been kind of following Thoreau I've been kind of in this landscape, and I had never read him. I'd never read Thoreau. I didn't grow up in New England. I grew up in California. So for whatever reason, he just wasn't on our reading. Like here, people, in high school read Thoreau. They hate it, I think. But so I finally read some of his work, and he's an extraordinary writer, and really his descriptions of this landscape, and it's funny how you start to notice when you're in a landscape, like there's history here, and there's like, what did Thoreau do to this landscape by observing it as carefully and closely as he did and writing about it like he's still here, his presence seeped into my being. And it wasn't until I wandered by his grave and I thought, oh my God, he's been with me, and I didn't quite realize it. The other thing is the title for that project is called A Murmur in the Trees. The other person who kind of helped was Emily Dickinson. That poem, I pinched the title from that poem. I blatantly steal from poets whenever I can. So all of my titles, most of them are from Emily Dickinson. One of them is from Dylan Thomas. And because I figured they write better than me. And, Emily Dickinson can do in a few short words the same thing as a photograph. She can convey an idea or a sense or a meaning in a few words. And it's like, wow. And I think photographs can do that too. And I have this theory that she would have been a fantastic photographer if she'd been born maybe a little later. Of course, she's also like this amazing wordsmith. So we're not always, visual people aren't always wordsmiths. But her poem, A Murmur in the Trees, it's kind of a long poem, but in the end, the last line in the poem, I found it a little inscrutable. I wasn't sure what she was saying, but in the end, I kind of walked away with, I feel like she was sort of chiding people for not noticing things in the forest. And then I think at the end of the poem, and I think I misread the poem too. I'm not sure that, most poetry teachers would agree with me, but it helped me my own interpretation of that poem helped me to think about, why am I doing the triptychs? Because it felt to me like what she was saying at the end is, oh, maybe I'm not seeing something that someone else is seeing, like maybe that perception. So this one line in the poem at the very end, that's sort of what I ended up taking away from it. And then I thought, well, okay, since this is clearing up my thinking about perception and how the eye works and how the brain works, so I'll just pull the first line from that poem as the title, because why not?
Right.
So I do think actually sometimes literary references can help you think about your work too.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to loop back to triptych stuff from more of a practical perspective, because I've seen a few people do triptychs over the years, and I feel like there's lots of different ways you can do it. I mean, you could literally do like a panorama, and put that into a triptych presentation, or you can take an existing photo and chop it up or whatever. But I feel like the more interesting triptychs are where the three images are of the same subject-ish, but of different kind of viewpoints of that subject. And then they're woven together and put together in a way that helps to create this cohesive idea. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about some practicality around triptychs and how they might have the ability to convey ideas or concepts where a single photo can't.
Yeah. So one thing, there's a photographer named Lois Connor. I think it's Lois Connor. She's also does multiple panel landscapes. She does them with a banquet camera though, like this wide, and then she puts them in vitrines. They look like Chinese scrolls, very cool. And I saw her talk about what she's doing, and it's like she calls it a continuum of the landscape. So like she might be taking a 360-degree view and it's flat. I like that idea of a continuum of the landscape. In terms of practicality, I think I mentioned before, I think each picture needs to be able to kind of stand on its own as a complete image. I do think you need something that runs through horizontally to carry your eye across. I like to play around with different focal planes. So in a way, it mirrors a little bit how our eyes function. So if you're in a landscape, you might see something close, but everything else gets blurry in the way your eyes work, right? We don't see the way a camera records. And so I'm interested in that kind of, you look closely, then you look farther away, then like the way we see. And I'm trying to maybe get at that a little bit with using these different focal planes within a 3-panel picture,
Have you
so you
ever
kind of move in and out,
have you ever
and
done one where it's like the exact same view but 3 different focal planes?
yes, I'm actually working on something that will be, and it'll be in this show that I mentioned. It'll be on a screen. And one thing that I always love when I look down in the ground glass, yeah, especially if I'm doing a more detailed picture, is when I change the focal plane, suddenly things will come in focus that you just don't see. Like they're completely out of focus and they're just not there, right? And then you change the focal plane and a little berry or a little knot in a twig or a leaf, and that kind of back and forth. And I'm actually working on a piece employing that, but it has to be
Mm.
like on a screen. So it'll be a loop. So yeah, I am actually doing something along those lines. I had started doing pictures like that and I wasn't sure how to present them. I was like, how can I get this kind of depth, and I realized it has to be kind of a moving piece. So I'm working on that.
You could do that using video as well. I mean, you could
Yeah.
totally change your plane of focus while recording the
Right.
video and
Right.
things like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably doing it a harder way than I should, but I still, it's that particular camera. Like I'm trying to convey what I'm seeing through the ground glass, you
Right.
know? So,
Right.
so yeah, so I am kind of working on something like that. I have also played around with different, and this can get tricky, different like shutter speeds. So I have a picture of my son on a river, and the middle frame had a longer shutter, so the water gets
Mm.
that glassy. But then the two on either side, it was a shorter shutter, so the water is stopped, and it's so the texture changes. The thing
Mm-hmm.
that gets tricky with that is the way in which, and this is practical advice too, the way in which film records color in a long exposure as opposed to a short one is a little different. So trying to get them to match up, because you do have to kind of match the color across all 3 pictures for them to
Mm.
work. That, which can be, especially if you're shooting like early in the morning on a snowy day, for example, that can be
Right.
really, sometimes you just get weird color casts. And we had one picture I was working on, and it was like whack-a-mole. Every time we'd fix the color on one frame, it wouldn't match up with another one, and then we try and fix that, and then in the end I had to give up because there was nothing, it just wasn't gonna
Yeah.
coalesce.
As you were describing it, I was envisioning this scene where you could even, same thing, you could have your camera stay in the same position and you've got a figure running through the frame. And one of the first one could be like a longer shutter speed, so the figure is kind of blurry. Then the
Yeah,
next one could be a little bit less long of a shutter speed, and so it's less blurry. And then the last one, they're still. Something
yeah,
like that. But it conveys movement across,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it
That'd be
tells a
hard to pull
story.
off too. That'd be, yeah, yeah.
You think about triptychs, right? Like there's all kinds of, you can play with shutter speed, aperture, depth
Hmm.
of field.
Hmm.
You could also play around with seasons, right? You could take the
Oh,
same
absolutely.
photo and do like spring, summer, winter, fall,
And I
whatever, 4
have I
4.
have done that with several pictures. I've definitely gone back and photographed the same places. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't,
Right.
but I do kind of visit the same places quite frequently,
Mm-hmm.
and it's another way to kind of really look at the landscape. Like if you go back to, a part of the reason I'm not really big on doing this as a traveler is like I'd hate to not be able to go back someplace like, 6 months later when the light is different. Like it's nice to have this sort of landscape that's accessible to me. and be able to return, and I have one tree that I love this, and it's this dancing tree, and I have photographed it several times. The first time was the best time though, like every other one, it hasn't been as strong a picture, but I don't know what's up with that, but I've done it at different seasons, and then the other thing that's kind of interesting is I'm often photographing along or near the confluence. We have the Sudbury River and the Assabet River come together to form the Concord River. And there's this confluence, and Thoreau wrote about that confluence. And some years it's, we've had a rainy summer and it's been flooded, and I can't even get to this one little section called Egg Rock. And other years it's just low, and there's even a little island in the middle of the river that's you don't normally see. So it's kind of interesting to watch the rhythm of the seasons, how the seasons unfold, and how from summer to summer things might change slightly. So that's another thing that I feel like I've become really conscious of, what the rivers are doing around here, what the meadows look like, what the trees are doing. It just becomes, I just feel like I've developed a bond with the landscape that I didn't have before when I was photographing my kids. It's like this has really been since like 2019 when I really started this work. I feel like it's just part of my being now.
That's one of the things I love about photography, is that it helps us develop and establish those relationships with place.
Yeah, it really does.
And then that translates into us wanting to learn more about that place, and translates into us wanting to take actions that protect that place. So I think photography is such an interesting gateway to all of those types of things.
Yeah. I grew up in California, and deep down, I'd love to go back and do some childhood landscapes. But I think it'd be really hard because I just haven't been in that landscape in such a long time,
I was just going to ask you one more question about a triptych concept.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on combining images of completely different locations to create a triptych?
I actually did a couple of those early on. I realized it was going to be so hard to do that. I'd have to shoot so much to do that successfully, and that's when I started to think, no, I'd rather look more deliberately and at what's in front of me, rather than hoping that I can do lots of pictures and then hope I can find some that'll work together. I think also it just requires a certain kind of eye. I have a studio mate who's absolutely fabulous at doing that. Like, she can create diptychs and triptychs and interesting combinations of pictures. And I just feel like she's like, I don't know, it's part of her genetic makeup, to do that. And it's not quite how I can work. But I think if somebody has the ability to find disparate elements, among some pictures, and to create something, a triptych or a tetraptych out of that, I think that's a fabulous skill, and I bow down to their superior, abilities at editing and sequencing,
Yeah, I think it's somewhat doable if you have a lengthier time frame of body of work that is consistent. Like,
yeah,
I photograph a lot of mountains in fall,
mm-hmm,
and so I have a fair number of images that feature like changing fall colors, mountains, and dramatic light. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is, it's actually kind of funny. I recently just went through you were talking about printing off 5x7s, but I recently just printed off a ton of 5x7s of images with the purpose of trying to create like triptychs of them, and trying to figure out what combinations of images work.
Spread them out on a table, and just start moving them around like a puzzle, which is actually the couple of ones that I did where I did that. That's exactly what we did. I did that when I was in the MFA program, and I was working with a mentor, and we just had a bunch of small prints on a big table, and we were moving these together. And I was like, oh, wow, look at these two I was turned one on its side and one the correct way. And then I just put them together as a single file. It's kind of a cool piece, but again, I didn't really go down that path, because I just thought this is going to require so much shooting.
Yeah.
And in a way that I was thinking wasn't going to be the way I normally like to shoot, but it was a really interesting exercise. And it definitely was part of how I arrived at making triptychs, and I feel like everything I've done before informs what I do now, from the magazine work to my kids to, the iPhone and just photo editing and throwing a bunch of small prints on a table and doing those exercises where you're moving pictures around and looking at them, even working with other people's photographs to kind of create a portfolio. All of that informs my own work. And I think, even though I've done a lot of different kinds of work, I think I have a consistent eye through it. Like, I think they do have my sort of imprint on them, even though some of it's black and white and some of it's color and with different cameras and stuff. So I think the more you photograph, the more you're able to find your voice and find who you are in the medium. Because I think it's a hard medium to do that. It's easier to kind of master it technically. And I think finding your voice in it, I think that's the hard part. That's the taking a lot of pictures part and the looking at pictures on the big table, small prints, that's that's where the real work has to happen.
Well, another topic I wanted to talk to you about, and you kind of started to allude to it when you were talking about your approach to creating artist statements, is this idea of the relationship that exists between the artist, the subject, and the viewer. And we were talking offline about this, and you had described it as a circle of relationships, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that concept.
I think it's something actually that I don't know if you know John Sharkovsky. He was the curator at the Museum of Modern Art for many, many years, and he wrote a book called Mirrors or Windows, and I think a lot of photography functions like, is it a mirror into another world? Or does it reflect you as a viewer or the photographer, or is it a window into another world? And I do think that whatever you make, like the photographs that you make, if they just go into a drawer and nobody sees them, they're not really complete, right? Like, I feel like you don't need to find a huge audience, but I think if somebody sees it other than yourself, then it sort of completes the work, And that's sort of what I consider a little bit of a circle, and how we perceive the world and how we're using the tool, the camera, to convey something of our own perceptions. And then the other part of this is, and this is actually something that I gleaned from one of my teachers at Pratt, who was important to me. He said something along the lines of, we each have our own kind of world within us, our own experiences, our own baggage, our own, and we bring all that, and as a photographer, I have all of that, and I'm out in the world and I make a picture, I respond to something and I make a picture, and then I go about processing it, printing it, and then putting it out in the world. And then if a viewer comes along or someone else comes along and sees the work and they have their stuff, right? And they respond to the photograph that I made, I feel like we've communicated on a level that's much deeper than just chatting on Facebook or something, or just talking about the price of tea or something. Like, we've communicated on a deeper, more human level. I don't know if that's true or not, but I like that idea. I like that making art does, so when my pictures touch somebody, and it's really nice if they tell me, if somebody says, oh, this really moved me, it reminded me of something, or reminded me of a person, or it reminded me of, something in their past, or even some emotion. I mean, that to me is kind of where that circle closes, and that's where you've made a kind of deep emotional connection. I think that's what art does. Like, it communicates in a way that is not as superficial as a lot of the ways that we communicate.
One of the things that I've always been amazed by in that particular dynamic is that usually what I responded to and why I captured the photograph is completely different than what the viewer attaches to it in terms of their own meaning and, like you're saying, their stuff. And I've always found that to be really interesting from a couple of perspectives. Like, first of all, like there's kind of this idea out there we should have some artistic intent behind our images, right? Which is,
Hmm.
I think, for a lot of us, there's truth to that, right? We have artist
Right.
statements and there's a purpose to what we're creating. But at the same time, I feel
At the same
like
time, that's sort of what's the point? Because
all
somebody's going
that
to
goes
come
out the
along and
window.
like, yeah. Well, and that's very true. Like, I think I saw a show recently where the curator was doing a theme, right? And suddenly the intention of the picture, the intention of the photographer was completely sort of erased by the theme that the picture was in. It didn't change. It was a good
Hmm.
photograph, but the context of the show changed the meaning of the photograph. So your intention, I mean, even though I think it's fine to write about your intention, at the end of the day, it may not matter, right? To the viewer, what your intention is. And that's okay too. Like, I think that's, to me, that expands the ability of the work to communicate
Hmm.
something. So yeah, I mean, it's, don't get too stuck on your intentions, because people will come along and change the meaning, or they might. I had a curator. We have, there's an eclipse coming up out here, and there was one a few years ago, and I had a curator who was out west and at a gallery, and they were going to have a full eclipse. I think it was in 2017, and
Hmm.
he did an eclipse themed show, and he picked a couple of my pictures that where it was one of the black and white pictures, my kid was holding a magnifying glass in front of his face, and it blocked his eyes. Like, he wouldn't lift it up. Like, I wanted his eyes, but he wouldn't. And then there was another one where he was sort of, his eyes were blocked, and so that was what this curator picked for this eclipse thing. And I never would have thought of those two pictures. But then when I realized what they were doing, I thought, oh, I kind of love this. Like, my intention with the picture was so different, and then his interpretation coming along with this kind of idea. So that's but that expands the breadth of the art. When other people bring their ideas to it. So
Yeah, it's I feel like this whole dynamic is I don't want to use the word problematic, but it's just a fascinating twist on things. I mean, photographers a lot of photographers are constantly wrapped up in this internal struggle of like, am I a photographer or am I an artist or am I a
oh
lens-based artist or like what do I call myself? And like, and like there's all of these questions that people have about that, the labeling of ourselves and the process of creation. And there's other people like Guy Tal who are like, I'm just an artist and photography is my chosen tool. And then there's other people like my friend Sarah Marino who's like, I just see myself as a photographer, and whatever that means, it's fine. And so it's just interesting how these words get all wrapped up into kind of personal identity and how we
yeah.
think about the creation of the work. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that particular
Oh,
aspect of
I
things.
generally, for the most part, call myself a photographer. But I also, I'm at this point old enough now. I feel comfortable enough saying I'm an artist too. For a long time, that felt like pretentious or something, but
Uh-huh.
it doesn't anymore. I mean, I feel like I'm an artist, but I usually typically say I'm a photographer. And I think when somebody's a lens-based artist, I think they're kind of making art that's different than just sort of, I am dealing with the world that's in front of me. Like, I have a camera, I'm out in the world, I'm making pictures of stuff in front of me. I'm not doing what a lot of lens-based artists are doing, which is maybe collage or digital imaging or digital or even AI. Like, that's all those tools don't interest me, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't fit with my intentions or my just what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm pretty comfortable just with photographer. And I think the sooner you kind of get off that anxiety, the better. Like, I think don't fret so much about the labels. Like, you have to be true to yourself. You have to be, you know, um, I think, confident in your own work and confident in your own voice. And you will only find it if you make the work. And to me, that's the most important thing. And I think as long as you stay as true to yourself as you possibly can. And I also think it's really important to lean into your like emotional state that you're in. Like, these different projects I did with my kids, I was responding to things that were going on in my life and things that were, like I was leaning into, and whenever I'm making pictures, I'm trying to lean into how I am feeling that day, because I think it will find its way into your photographs. And the more you are just trust your own emotional intelligence, the better you will be as a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
The more true the work will be to who you are. And I think the sooner you get off, like people, I think when I was younger, certainly, I want people to like my pictures. And at some point I thought, you know what, I really don't need everybody to like my pictures. I just don't, and I think once you kind of get past that too, your work will probably start getting better, actually, or more true to yourself. So I think some of that sort of, stress about labels is also a little bit about, whether people like your work or not.
Mm.
And I just think it's don't worry about it. Like, not everybody's gonna like your work. I mean, it's just impossible. Not everybody is gonna like what you do, and it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I know when I got to that point, my work definitely, it started to become my own work, a little bit more me. But I think it took me a while to get there, you know. I
Mm-hmm.
was like a lot of people, was, oh, am I an artist? Or, and
Yeah. No, it's a tricky one for some people for sure.
yeah, yeah.
I think
But I think the more work you make, the more comfortable you'll be in identifying who you are as an artist or a photographer. I just really do think it's all about the work
mhm.
that you make.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I mean, not to go down this road too strongly, but of late there's this Facebook group that it's called World Class Landscape Photographers, something like that. So
Oh,
the assumption is that it's landscape photography, and then there's all of these preconceived ideas I think most people have about what that means, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
like you're talking about capturing what's in front of you and not like digital montage and things of
Right.
that nature. And I think that's what most people would associate with the words landscape photography, or that particular nomenclature. And
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting because there's been a lot of people posting like very realistic looking AI creations in that group.
Oh,
And
really? Oh.
of
I mean,
course
I don't
they're
think that's
like,
photography. It's a tool, but I just don't think AI is photography. Like, it's not a light-based medium, I don't think.
right. Well, it's
You
just been
know?
interesting to see the arguments and the
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
how people
Well, I'm probably
defend
going to piss people
themselves.
off because I just said that.
No, I don't think so.
But,
I mean, I've been pretty vocal about. I think AI is just a tool, and I think you can create some really cool stuff with AI. I mean, there's some people that are doing like AI mediated stuff where they take some of their own photography, they do some AI, they combine them. They're
mhm.
just using it as a tool to get to
Yeah,
the end result, which is ideally some form of artistic creation.
right.
Um,
And I don't have a problem with that. I think if people want to do that, you know, I actually have a friend, Fran Foreman, who does some wonderful collage type work with AI and her own photographs. Not landscape, but really they're kind of wonderful, but I don't know, that just doesn't quite interest me
yeah, no, me
personally,
neither. I
so
just
like,
yeah, I just think it is a little bit bizarre that people like. I'm all about people creating however you want to create away.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, but then why do you want to be seen as something it's not? Like that's the piece that's confusing to me, and I think that's where the tension gets created is the people
right.
creating that type of stuff. They're putting it into a Facebook group called landscape photography,
Oh, I
right?
see. Yeah, and it may or may not actually be.
Right, and then that I
Yeah,
think that's where the tension gets
yeah,
created. Is
yeah.
like I'm not people aren't painting with a brush and with oil paints, taking a picture of it and then putting it in the group and calling it landscape photography. Like that would be
Right,
silly.
right, right.
And it's not to say that like paintings of landscapes aren't awesome. They are,
Yeah,
but it's just like you wouldn't call yourself a landscape photographer. You would call yourself a
a
painter.
painter.
you know?
I know. an AI artist or a,
or whatever, right? Like it's just
yeah,
strange that I
yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
I
So I
don't know
think
that I don't know that particular group, but I and there's a lot of like landscape photography out in the world that I find actually a lot of it is I don't even find it bad, but I find it postcard or calendar. Like there's a lot of photography, a lot of color landscape photography that I just wish it would move me a little bit more,
mm,
grand vistas. Like I don't do that. Like if I go to a grand vista, I probably would never take a picture there. Like I have to find more quirky
yeah,
landscapes to photograph, I don't think it's in my kind of DNA to do the grand sort of Ansel Adams grand vistas, right? That's just
sure.
not quite my and so that kind of landscape photography just doesn't always, but I look at it and I think, you know what, it's not that it's bad. Like it's not bad, it's just not quite my thing,
Just
you know.
doesn't do, yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah,
totally
yeah, and
totally
that's why,
fine.
and that's the thing where like let it go. It's okay. Like it's okay. But
Yeah, I'm not into
like
it.
yeah, yeah, you know, if
Yeah,
that's
and
what you want to do, then do it. I would never tell somebody not to, you
yeah,
know.
totally. The, the
It's
the
just
the only reason I had brought that up is because you were talking about the sooner that we can become more comfortable with what we actually are doing and
mhm,
what we're creating and why we're creating it, and being honest with ourselves about what it is we're doing,
right.
and not caring about external validation and what
Hmm.
people think of our photography or whatever our creations are, AI or whatever it
Right,
is.
right,
I
right,
think like just own what you're doing, be honest with your audience about what it is or isn't, and like
right.
the people that are super into what you're creating are gonna really like it.
They're going to
you know?
gravitate to it. And they'll find it. They'll find it. They'll find you.
Yeah. Yeah,
You
there's no
know.
reason to try to fool people
Right.
into thinking it's something it isn't. It's
Yeah.
just, well, there are reasons, but most of them are
Hmm.
based in ego-driven behavior that's
Yeah, like well
poisonous.
that there's plenty of that in photography.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, it's always
Right.
telling to me whether it's a straight photograph or a minimally edited photograph or a grand landscape photograph or an abstract photograph or an AI creation, whatever the thing is.
Hmm.
It's always, always, always telling to me when that person is faced with any form of criticism about the creation, and their
Mm.
response, if their response is very defensive and like they feel hurt and offended by whatever the comment is, to me that tells me they're not comfortable with what they've created.
That's possible. I also think that some people, I mean, I do write about photography, as I've said, and I think sometimes when I am going to be critical of art, of somebody's work, I want to be as constructive as possible. And I do think sometimes the conversations that end up happening on a place like Facebook are a little,
Yeah,
lack some level of tact. If you're going to be offer some critique, I think it should be constructive, right? So,
yeah. Hmm.
and when I offer critique, and it's usually, there was one person's work that I reviewed. This was a few years ago, and I loved the work. It was beautiful. I just thought the prints weren't that good, and they could have been bigger. Like I just wish, like I just was like, this work is so good, and the presentation is sort of falling flat for me. And I just, so I said that in as constructive a way as I possibly could. And I also
Sure.
realized that budgets being what they are, the person may not have been able to afford, better frames or better, whatever. But I did feel like it did a disservice to the work that it
Hmm.
wasn't presented as well as it could have been. And so like when you offer a critique, like how do you do that that's in a constructive way, you know and when I'm critiquing my students, this is what it's often, I'm trying to do it in a way. I mean, I grew up, in the era of like critique could often be, well, this sucks, go start over, and
Right.
there was that kind of, yeah, there was the kind of late 70s sort of art criticism critique was could be a little brutal. I was fortunate that I really didn't have too many. I think I had one drawing teacher who was a little bit like that, but I think I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's constructive.
Hmm.
I think it's, I would never critique somebody to the point of them wanting to give up doing what they're doing. Like I want people to keep making photographs. And I think it is possible to sort of critique somebody without being, personal. And I think if somebody then is really defensive, then yeah, they're probably not that comfortable with their work. And I think being able to take critique is also kind of an art in of itself. If somebody's going to offer you some kind of, critique about your work. I mean, I've had a few people critique, they sort of feel like my 3 panel pictures are really the sweet spot of that work, and the ones that are bigger don't really work as well for them. And you know what? I don't have a problem with somebody thinking that at all. Like, and I don't even really have a problem with them telling me that, And so I think there's a certain level of maturity that happens when you can, in fact, be critiqued without folding or becoming defensive. Take it in. There was one time I went to a portfolio review and this one reviewer said all kinds of stuff to me. I mean, I was like, oh, and I left thinking, I don't think he gets my work, like that was my sort of thinking. He doesn't get my work. And like, I don't know, 2-3 months later, and I'm out photographing again, I'm thinking about stuff they said. And it suddenly dawned on me, oh my God, they were right. So I sometimes feel like
I've had
that
happen.
feedback can sometimes just take a little while to sort of, work its way through you. And especially as you continue to do more work, because I think it's important to listen to how people respond to your work, and I think without being defensive, I think and if you don't like the critique, you can say, thank you so much for your thoughts and move on.
Right.
You don't have to take everything, to heart,
Right.
So
No, it's just interesting. Like, just yesterday, this guy posted a photo in that group, and like I don't even know what it is, but he photoshopped in something that was supposed to be the moon or some other object in the sky, and it was obvious that it was not the moon or like even a real version of the moon. And he was like defending, like, oh yeah, no, that was there. Yeah, like he just did. And I just didn't just say like, oh yeah, I added the moon, or added whatever this thing is, and here's why I did it, because I wanted to do X, Y, and Z, and like just own it. But like when people start just deflecting any valid, just don't lie to me.
Yeah. No, I know that's annoying. That is annoying. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's rampant right now with the AI stuff. Like people are posting. Someone posted one the other day. It was like obviously AI. People were saying, "Hey, this is AI. I'm pretty sure this is AI, right?" And he's like, "Oh no, that's real. I captured that just the other day with my camera." And it's like,
oh, and you're like, "Yeah, I don't think so."
Right? Like, just own what it is, man. Like, I don't understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we could beat that horse until it comes back to life and dies in over again. But, so couple more questions I have for you.
Sure.
So you talked a lot about the importance of writing. What tips do you have for people who don't like to write?
I think, and I think I may have mentioned this. I think keep a notebook with you in your camera bag. When you're out shooting, write some notes down. I think the hardest part is sort of getting the first draft done. So if you've made notes along the way, just your thoughts, your feelings on your statement when you're finally ready to write the statement. So I think it's a good idea. Or maybe like if you don't want to have a pen and piece of paper, do a little voice memo on your phone, and then transcribe that stuff, right? Just thoughts and feelings and what you're doing with the camera, what you're, all of that kind of thing. And that will start to help, and I also think just when you are, because I've actually haven't been photographing all that much lately. I did a bunch right around New Year's and then I really haven't been photographing, and I get a little panicky, like when I haven't photographed in a while, because it's just like you're a photographer, I have to get more pictures, right? And I think it's okay to every once in a while just step back and say, you know what, I'm going to look at pictures. I'm going to think about what I've done, and just spend some time looking at your photographs, do the big table, small prints kind of exercise, or put them on a bulletin board in your room or your studio or wherever you work, and live with them and look at them and think about them, because I think that will also start to generate ideas about how you can write about them.
Yeah.
And don't get too panicked if if you're like me, I shoot a lot every year, and I just every once in a while have these downtimes when I'm not shooting as much. And even though I get a little panicky about that, I realize that it's actually important. I'm actually, I'm working on a few other things. So that's part of the reason I just keep thinking, I don't want to add more film to scan right now. So it's okay, to take a break. Right.
Yeah.
And so I do think just spending that time, it's just as important as the going out and shooting, to look at your pictures, to think about them, to edit them, to sequence them, work on what the body of work is starting to look like. I think it's valuable to do that. And that will help you kind of write about it and contextualize what you're doing.
There's other reasons why people might not like writing. Like maybe there's a language barrier, or maybe they have dyslexia, or, maybe they have other disabilities that prevent them from being a good writer, but maybe they're okay with.
I actually have a little dyslexia myself. It's, and I know I was a slow reader as a kid, that it's hard to overcome that kind of thing. I think it's okay to get a fresh set of eyes, right? If you get a critique group, they can also help you with your writing. The other thing is, if you do a first draft, read it out loud. Write it, put it away, go to bed, go to sleep overnight, right? Come back to it, read it out loud to yourself. Does it sound like your voice? Does it sound conversational? Do you have sentences that are too long? I always have way long sentences, right? Shorten them. That's really, really valuable. Just read it out loud to yourself, read it out loud to a partner or spouse or whatever, whoever's around. Here, listen to this,
Yeah.
The statement should not be more than 3 paragraphs. It does not have to be a giant tome. It doesn't have to be academic. It shouldn't be. Just clear, concise, active verbs, and get someone to listen to you read it to them, and they can probably help you edit it afterwards.
Yeah. There's more applications for writing too, like blog posts or maybe just a description of a photograph or a trip you went on. But where I was going to go with it is, like I said, maybe there's other reasons why you're not adept at writing. There's AI tools. People are going to hate me for saying this.
Yeah, once again,
people are going to hate me for saying this, but there are AI tools that exist that are actually pretty interesting when it comes to text. So one example is I actually use this program for my podcast show notes and to create social media content for my podcast, mostly just as a time saver. But they have an app. It's called Cast Magic, and they actually have an app where you can download the app. You can record yourself talking. So let's say you did an outing, right? And you're driving home from your trip and you just want to describe what the trip is about. You can just talk into this thing and describe how you were feeling and describe blah, 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 all these things. Just record your thoughts, right? That file can then get uploaded to their system. The AI will, basically it's a language learning model, right?
Wow. And
then you can prompt it to spit out content based on what that sound recording was about. So you could say write 3 paragraphs distilling what this sound recording is about from an active voice perspective. You can use all those words.
Wow.
It'll spit out pretty good stuff.
I haven't tried any of those tools yet. I just haven't done that yet. I guess maybe it'd be easier.
I'm just playing devil's advocate a little bit. I still think there's tremendous value in sitting down and writing yourself. But if you're someone who just hates writing, you're not good at writing, you don't want to learn how to write, maybe you have a disability that prevents you from writing, whatever, there are tools that exist that can help you.
Yeah, definitely. I think even Grammarly is helpful for some people.
Grammarly is AI.
Yeah. So, that's any way to get there. But I do think that you have to do the heavy lifting. The content, what you're making, what you're doing, what you're thinking, that's still on you, right? An AI program might help you fine tune it and polish it, but I do think that at the end of the day, you can't just expect an AI tool to whole cloth come up with your statement without,
for sure.
what it is, some prompt. that's more than just, I went to the Grand Canyon and photographed, right? Like I
There has
think
to
you
be
have to
some
think about,
substance.
yeah. And the substance behind your photographs, you have
Right.
to think about that.
All right. So you had talked just briefly about this earlier, but I would love for you to tell our audience about the solo show that you have coming up.
So in the fall, October, I'll be having a show at the Danforth Art Museum, and in a nice little intimate gallery. I'm working on creating a kind of installation. I'm hoping the gallery will feel kind of like a sanctuary, because I feel like my pictures have a calmness to them. You'll actually walk through. We've got some, I'm printing a couple of them on fabric, so you'll kind of have to walk through this fabric to enter some woods on the fabric. And then we'll have a large picture on the back wall and some smaller ones on the sides. And I'm also collaborating with an audio person, so there'll be a sound component.
Oh, cool.
So that'll be, and I'm working on a book. So that's the other reason I haven't been photographing, but I'd like to get a book of this work done in time for that show. So I'm working on that right now. And
yeah, that's a heavy lift.
Yeah. So, but I'm really excited about it. I'm working with a really great book designer, and found a wonderful writer to write an essay. So it's that hopefully will be out like early fall. I'm really, really excited about that. It's the first time I'm really kind of putting everything into a book like this.
And how can people stay up to date with what's going on with you?
I am active on Facebook and Instagram and a little bit on Threads, but that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So I'm not hard to find on social media.
Awesome.
And so
right
people can connect that way as well, or LinkedIn.
Well, last question. Who do you recommend for the podcast?
Because, one person might be fun for you to talk to is Frank Armstrong, who's he retired from Clark 2 years ago, I guess, 3 years ago, something like that. And he's in his 80s and amazing energy, and the kind of photographer who mastered like zone system, kind of black and white, classic Western landscape photography, but also is like extraordinarily good with digital imaging and Photoshop. The breadth of his work is amazing. And he's the kind of guy who likes to go hit the road and on secondary roads. Like, he doesn't like going faster than 35 miles an hour, and he'll drive across the country that way, looking for really, really sort of American roadsides. So, and he's kind of wonderful and he's just been at it for so long. And I mean, he's got to be in his mid 80s now. So he might be fun. And then I was thinking about another colleague of mine, Erin Carey. She did some kind of interesting landscapes of like Christmas tree lots. I love that work. And then she's done something a little bit different. It's a little more intuitive, kind of sense of place. She's up on the North Shore in Boston. She and I worked together at the New England School of Photography before they closed. Oh, and then there was a photographer I think I mentioned to you. I don't know him, but I think he's out in Kansas or Oklahoma or someplace flat, right? And he's been making, I love his landscapes. He got a Guggenheim Fellow a year or so ago, and he makes these kind of spare, obviously flat, landscapes. Sometimes he does triptychs, and his triptychs are like really different than mine. I really like how he also gives them way more white space between each panel. Like, I obsessed over that for a long time. So anyway, his name is Philip Haying. I don't know how you pronounce it, Heying. But I've been drawn to his work lately. I've been really liking his work. So those are a few people that have been on my mind lately. So
perfect. Well, Suzanne, this has been a lot of fun, and I just wanted to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to have a chat with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to Suzanne for the wonderful conversation on the podcast. As always, I'd love to hear your feedback about the episode. The best way to do that is to hop on over to patreon.com/fstop and listen and chime in on the discussions about each week's episode. Joining is free, so what are you waiting for? One thing I wanted to note, Suzanne iterated multiple times the importance of seeking feedback on your work in order to improve as a photographer. In my mind, there are 3 very good ways for you to be able to do that. You can join the critique forums on Nature Photographers Network. It's just $49 per year, and you can even get a 10% off discount by using the code FSTOP10. You can also join one of the critique mastermind groups that Eric Bennett offers. He partners with other world-class photographers to offer a small group experience that will undoubtedly transform your work. And lastly, you can join me on an all-inclusive workshop. We build in lots of time for group image critiques, and it's honestly one of the best ways that you can improve as a photographer. You can find a link for all of these things in the show notes. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.